We spend half our lives building walls between ourselves and the people we love, calling it distance. But the hardest part isn't the silence. It's realizing you have forgotten how to break it. This is a story about a rainy afternoon in Chicago and a phone call that took 30 years to make. The city never asked if you were ready. Chicago in November had a way of reminding you of that. The wind coming off Lake Michigan like something with a personal grudge, cutting through your coat, your skin, finding the soft places you thought you'd protected. The L rattled overhead on its ancient iron bones, and the sound of it was the city's heartbeat, irregular and relentless. The sound of 10,000 people going somewhere they may or may not have wanted to be. Daniel Marsh had been driving the same bus route for 11 years, Route 66, not the famous one, not the road in the songs and the postcards. This was the city version, a number assigned by the Chicago Transit Authority to a crosstown line that began at the edge of Marquette Park, wound its way through Pilsen and Chinatown, cut north through the South Loop, and ended its run at Michigan Avenue, where the department store windows glowed with things that cost more than Daniel's monthly take-home pay. He didn't mind the route. Some drivers complained about their assignments the way other men complained about their marriages, constantly, hopelessly, with a kind of tender resentment that meant they'd never actually leave. Daniel had stopped complaining about things somewhere around 1991, when his son Marcus turned 12 and started looking at him with eyes that measured everything, and found most of it wanting. He pulled the bus out of the garage at 5:47 a.m., before the son had made any real commitment to appearing. The first passengers were always the same kind of people, night shift workers headed home, their faces carrying that particular exhaustion that isn't just about sleep. It's about the specific sadness of being awake when the world is dark and asleep when the world is bright. A woman in scrubs carrying a paper bag that smelled like fried chicken. Two men in work boots speaking quietly in Spanish. An old man in a gray coat who always rode to the third stop and then got off. And Daniel had driven this route long enough that he'd stopped wondering where the man went, accepting him as one of the city's small mysteries, the kind you learn to carry without needing to solve. Daniel drove. He'd learned, over 11 years, that driving a bus was not really a driving job. It was a witnessing job. You saw people at the edges of their lives. The woman crying quietly in the back with her forehead against the cold glass. The teenager in a fast food uniform, falling asleep against a pole before his stop. The couple in their 50s, sitting side by side reading separate books, their shoulders touching, saying everything without saying anything. You saw the city the way a river sees a valley, not from above, not with the distance of a map, but from inside it, feeling every bend. His radio crackled. 47, you've got a gap up at Kermack. Pick up the pace if you can. Copy that, Daniel said. He didn't pick up the pace. He'd learned that hurrying a bus route was like hurrying grief. You could push it, technically, but things got missed, things got dropped, and somebody always paid for it later. Marcus had called 3 weeks ago. It was a Thursday evening, and Daniel was sitting in his apartment on West 47th, a two-bedroom that had been a two-bedroom when Marcus was a boy, and was now a one-bedroom with the second room used for things Daniel didn't quite have a word for. There was a desk in there with papers on it, a box of Marcus's childhood things, drawings, a Little League trophy, a retainer in a case that Daniel had kept for reasons he couldn't explain, a window that looked out at the alley, and a street light that came on every evening at precisely 5:53 and shut off at 6:19 every morning. And Daniel had noticed this consistency long before he admitted to himself that he was the kind of man who noticed such things because he had run out of other things to pay attention to. The phone rang and it was Marcus, and Daniel said, "Hey, son." And there was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that has weather in it. "Hey, Dad." They hadn't spoken in 8 months, not because of a fight. Daniel and Marcus were not the kind of people who fought loudly. They were the kind of people who went quiet, who let the distance grow, the way mold grows in a corner you've stopped checking, slow and silent, until one day you look and think, how long has that been there? Marcus was 28 now. He lived in Seattle, had moved there 6 years ago for a tech job, the kind of job Daniel understood only in the vaguest terms, something involving databases and systems and a salary that Marcus had once mentioned in passing, and that Daniel had tried to respond to without showing the thing he felt, which was not jealousy exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the same neighborhood as pride and didn't always get along with its neighbor. "How are you?" Daniel asked. "I'm okay. I'm okay." A pause. "I'm coming to Chicago. Next month. Conference thing." "Okay. I thought maybe we could, I don't know, get dinner or something." "I'd like that," Daniel said. And then neither of them said anything for a moment. And in that silence was everything. 8 months, and the 8 months before that when the calls were short and functional, and before that the years since the divorce, and before that the years of the marriage itself, which had been good in the beginning and then complicated in the middle, and then honest at the end, which was its own kind of pain, because honesty at the end of a marriage is not a comfort, it's an accounting. Marcus's mother, Daniel's ex-wife, Renee, had not been a bad woman. She had been a woman who married someone she believed would grow in one direction and watched him grow in another. She'd wanted a man who moved upward. Daniel had moved inward. She had wanted expansion. Daniel had found his whole world in a bus route and a quiet apartment and a son he didn't know how to reach. The divorce happened when Marcus was 15. Marcus had handled it the way intelligent, sensitive children handle things that hurt them, by becoming very focused on something else. In his case, school, then college, then a city 3 states away. "Okay," Daniel said again into the phone. "What day?" "December 5th. I get in the night before. I'm off on the 6th. We could do lunch." "Lunch is good." "Okay." "Okay. Good." They hung up. Daniel sat with the phone in his hand for a while. Outside, the streetlight came on. He picked up a woman on Cermak who was crying. She wasn't dramatic about it. She wasn't the kind of crying that makes a scene. She was the kind of crying that a person does when they've been crying for a while, and the body has resigned itself to it, the way it resigns itself to rain. She dropped her fare into the machine without looking at Daniel, and went to the back and sat down and looked out the window. Daniel watched her in the rear-view mirror the way he watched all his passengers, not intrusively, not with the gawking curiosity that pretends to be concern, but with the specific attention of someone whose job has made him understand that human beings in pain often just need to be in the presence of someone who sees them without requiring anything in return. She rode to the stop at 18th Street. When she stood to get off, she paused at the front of the bus and said, without looking at him, "Thank you for driving smoothly." Daniel nodded. "You take care of yourself." She got off into the November wind, and the doors closed behind her, and Daniel pulled back into traffic, and he thought, this is what the job is, really. Not the schedule, not the route, not the CTA manual, or the radio checks, or the overtime dispute the union was currently locked in with the city. It was this, the brief, anonymous moments of being present for someone who needed a soft landing in a hard morning. He thought about Marcus. He thought about all the years he had driven Marcus places, to school, to practice, to a birthday party at a skating rink in Bridgeport, where Marcus had fallen twice and laughed both times with the particular freedom of a child who hasn't yet learned to be embarrassed by falling. Daniel had sat in the parking lot for 2 hours waiting, listening to the radio, and he remembered thinking, I would sit in this parking lot forever. I would wait in any parking lot in the world, for as long as it takes. He had meant it. He still meant it. The problem was that by the time Marcus was 15, Marcus had stopped needing rides, and Daniel had never quite figured out what to offer instead. The city slid past the windows. By 8 a.m., the bus was full, the morning rush crowd, which was its own ecosystem. Office workers in long coats staring at phones, students with backpacks the size of small apartments, a man in a suit reading a folded newspaper, which Daniel noted because no one read folded newspapers anymore, and there was something both sad and stubborn about it, the way certain things persist past their time, because the people attached to them refused to let go. He thought about his own stubbornnesses. He'd never left Chicago. Renee used to say he was married to the city before he was married to her, and in the years since the divorce, he'd come to understand she wasn't entirely wrong. Chicago was not an easy city to love. It was cold in ways that went beyond temperature, hard in ways that went beyond concrete. A city that had seen enough of human nature to stop being surprised by it, and had developed a kind of blunt, unsentimental affection for its people as a result. You want soft? Go to San Diego. Chicago said, I'll give you real. Daniel understood that. He was a Chicago man in that way, not charming, not warm in any obvious sense, but steady, present, the kind of man who showed up. The problem, Marcus had once said, during one of their harder conversations, the year before he moved to Seattle, was that showing up wasn't the same as being there. You were always home, Dad, Marcus said. You were just never there. Daniel had not known how to answer that. He still didn't, fully. But he'd been thinking about it for 6 years. There was a boy who rode his bus every Tuesday and Thursday. Daniel had noticed him over the past 2 months. 12, maybe 13. Backpack covered in patches. Headphones around his neck that he never actually put on his ears. He always got on at the stop near the school on Loomis, and he always rode to the stop near the library on Blue Island, and he always sat in the same seat, 3rd row, window side, and he always had a book, not a phone. A book. In 1997, this was not unusual. In 1997, children still read books on buses because there was nothing else to read. But there was something about the way this particular boy read, fully, completely, with the kind of absorption that meant the world outside the window had ceased to exist, that Daniel found himself noticing. He reminded Daniel of Marcus, not in any specific physical way. Marcus had been a quieter boy, more careful, always watching the adults around him with that measuring look. This boy was different. You could see the thoughts moving across his face, the reactions to whatever was on the page, little micro-expressions of surprise or recognition or delight. But the reading, the way he held the book, that was Marcus. Daniel had taken Marcus to the Harold Washington Library the year it opened, 1991, the big building downtown with the strange ornamentation on the roof, those green owls and acanthus leaves that looked like they belonged on a different building in a different city, and maybe that was the point. Marcus had been 12. He'd walked through the atrium and looked up and said, quietly, "It looks like it's dreaming." Daniel hadn't known what to say to that, so he'd said nothing. He thought about that now, how many times he had said nothing when he should have said something. Not the right thing, necessarily. Just something. "That's a good way to put it, son. It does look like it's dreaming." Instead, he'd said nothing, and Marcus had tucked the observation back inside himself, and they'd gone to find the books Marcus needed for a school report, and the moment had passed. You don't know in the moment which moments you'll spend the next 30 years thinking about. December 5th came gray and cold. Daniel had the day off, had requested it weeks ago, traded a Sunday shift with a driver named Phil Kowalski, who owed him one from back in March. He woke at 6 anyway, the way he always did, body clock indifferent to vacation. He made coffee and stood at the window and watched the alley and thought about nothing in particular. Marcus's flight had landed the night before. He was staying at a hotel downtown, the Marriott on Michigan, Daniel assumed. The conference hotels were always on Michigan. They were meeting at a diner in Pilsen at noon. Marcus had chosen it, looked it up online, something he'd done from Seattle, finding a diner in a neighborhood he'd grown up near as if he needed a map to his own childhood. Daniel understood. You came back to a city you'd grown up in, and it was both exactly the same and entirely different, and you needed landmarks, familiar shapes, things that confirmed you were in the right place, even when you weren't sure you were. He showered, put on his good shirt, dark green, button-down, the one Renee had bought him years ago that he'd kept because he liked it, and also because he was the kind of man who kept things. He combed his hair in the bathroom mirror and looked at himself for longer than he usually did, 51 years old. The face in the mirror was not the face he thought of when he thought of himself. The mind always keeps a younger image on file, the self as it was at some formative moment, the self that still contained all possible futures. The face in the mirror was the face of a man who had made his choices, not bad choices, necessarily, not a ruined life, but specific, a life made particular by its decisions, shaped by what it had moved toward and what it had moved away from. He thought about the woman on the bus who'd thanked him for driving smoothly. He thought about Marcus at 12, looking up at the library ceiling. He put on his coat and went out into December. The diner was called Marisol's, and it smelled like coffee and butter and something baking in the back, and the windows were fogged at the edges from the heat inside, meeting the cold outside. And Daniel got there 10 minutes early, because he was always early, had been always early his entire life, his mother having instilled in him the belief that being on time was a form of respect, and being early was a form of love. He took a booth near the back and ordered coffee and waited. Marcus came in at 2 minutes past 12. Daniel recognized him from across the diner. Of course he did. This was his son. But there was also a moment of the strange doubling that happens when you haven't seen someone in a long time, where you see both the person you remember and the person they've become, overlaid on each other like two photographs taken at the same spot in different decades. Marcus at 12, at 15, at 22. And Marcus now, 28, taller than Daniel remembered thinking of him, broader in the shoulders, wearing a good coat, the kind of coat that cost real money, moving through the diner with the ease of a man who had learned how to move through spaces that were not his own. He saw Daniel and there was a beat, a brief, barely perceptible pause, and then he crossed the diner and slid into the opposite side of the booth and said, "Hey, Dad." "Hey, son." They looked at each other. "You look good," Marcus said. "You too." A waitress came and Marcus ordered coffee, and they looked at the menus for a moment, not because either of them needed time to decide, but because it was something to do with their hands and their eyes, while the rest of them figured out how to be in the same room again. They ordered eggs for Daniel, a sandwich for Marcus. The waitress left. "How's the conference?" Daniel asked. "Good. Boring in the way conferences are boring, but good." Marcus wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. "They flew us in from all over. There's a guy here from the Dublin office. I keep forgetting there's a Dublin office." "Big company." "Yeah." A pause. "Bigger every year." Daniel nodded. Outside, a bus went past the window. Not his route, a different line, the 18, and Daniel watched it for a moment without meaning to, the way you watch any familiar thing. "You still driving?" Marcus asked. "Yeah." "Same route?" "Same route." Marcus nodded slowly, and Daniel couldn't read the expression, which was not unusual. Marcus had always been careful with his expressions, precise, a boy who learned early that his face was a text people read, and who'd become a man who chose carefully what to let them see. "I've been thinking about you," Marcus said. "A lot, actually. The last few months." Daniel said nothing. He waited. He'd learned over 51 years that silence was sometimes the most honest thing you could offer. "I've been thinking about..." Marcus stopped, looked at his coffee, started again. "When I moved to Seattle, I told myself it was for the job, and it was, partly. But I think I also moved because..." He paused again, and Daniel saw something move across his son's face, the same micro-expression he'd noticed in the reading boy on the bus, something genuine and unguarded. "I think I needed distance from something I didn't understand yet. And I think what I didn't understand was you." Daniel looked at his son. "I wasn't angry," Marcus continued. "That's what I kept telling Mom, and she'd say, 'Then why don't you call him more?' And I didn't have an answer. I wasn't angry. I didn't blame you for anything. I just didn't know how to be in the same room as you without feeling this gap, this thing I couldn't name." "I know about that gap," Daniel said. Marcus looked up. "I've felt it too," Daniel said, "from my side." They sat with that for a moment, the acknowledgement of the gap, which was different from the gap itself, which was different from whatever might come after. "I think," Daniel said carefully, "I didn't know how to tell you things. I still don't. Always. I don't say things out loud the way some people do. I know that. I've known it a long time." He paused. "But I want you to know something, Marcus. I have thought about you every day, every single day. I don't mean that the way it sounds in a movie. I just mean it's true. You're in my head every day. The things you said when you were a kid, the way you laughed, that time at the library." He stopped. Marcus was very still. "You said it looked like he was dreaming," Daniel said. "The building. You were 12. And I didn't say anything back. And I have thought about that. I have thought about that specific moment more times than I can tell you. Because you were right. It did look like it was dreaming. And I should have said so." The diner was noisy around them. Other conversations, the clatter of the kitchen, the bell above the door as someone came in from the cold. None of it reached their booth. "I remember that," Marcus said. "I know you remember it. I know you remember a lot of things I didn't respond to the way I should have." "Dad, I'm not trying to apologize for everything. I don't think that works anyway. You can't apologize for a way of being. It's not honest. I just want to—" Daniel stopped, found the word. "I want to tell you that I know, that I'm not unaware, that I have been sitting with it." Marcus looked at him for a long time. 6 years, Marcus said finally. "That's a lot of sitting." "It is." And then Marcus laughed, a short surprise sound, not bitter, not performance, something that came from an unexpected place. And Daniel heard in it something he recognized, because he'd heard it when Marcus was young, when something caught him off guard in a way that pleased him. The particular laugh of a person who didn't expect to be amused and was. "You haven't changed," Marcus said. "No, that's not. I don't mean it as a criticism. I know." Their food came. They ate. The conversation moved, the way conversations move when the hardest part has been said, and everything after is both easier and more itself. Marcus talked about Seattle, about the work, about a woman he'd been seeing for 8 months named Diane, who was a landscape architect and who had, apparently, very strong opinions about drainage systems that Marcus found both baffling and endearing. Daniel talked about the route, about Phil Kowalski, about a regular passenger, a retired teacher named Mr. Okafor who rode the bus every Wednesday to a chess club in Chinatown, and who had, over 3 years of Wednesday rides, taught Daniel 7 chess openings purely through conversation, without a board, which Daniel thought was the most Chicago thing he'd ever experienced. Marcus listened to all of it. "You love that job," Marcus said. Daniel considered this. "I do. I used to not understand that." "And now?" Marcus turned his coffee mug slowly in his hands. "Now I think, I don't know. I think there's something about work that shows you what a person actually values, not what they say they value, what they actually return to, every day, what they're willing to go back to." He paused. "You've gone back to that route for 11 years. "Yeah. That means something." "It does to me." Marcus nodded. Outside, snow had started, not the heavy kind, not yet, just the first tentative flakes of a December afternoon, the kind that remind you what's coming without committing to it. "I'm going to call more," Marcus said. "I know I say that." "You don't have to promise." "I want to." He looked at Daniel directly, the measuring look, but different than before, less like assessment and more like contact. "I just want to stay in it. Whatever it is, I want to stay in it." Daniel thought about Route 66, about 5:47 in the morning, and the woman in scrubs and the old man who got off at the third stop. and the boy with the book who sat in the third row and read the way his son used to read. He thought about all the passengers he'd carried, hundreds of thousands of them over 11 years, each of them briefly present and then gone, each of them carrying something he'd never know, each of them trusting him, in the small, anonymous way of public transit, to take them from where they were to where they needed to be. He thought about how that trust was quiet and everyday and mostly invisible, and how it was, nonetheless, the thing he'd built his life around. "I'd like that," Daniel said. He meant the calls. He meant the staying in it. He meant everything that was trying to be said in the warm corner of the Pilsen diner on a December afternoon, with snow just beginning outside and coffee getting cold, and the two of them, father and son, finally in the same room. Not perfectly, not without the weight of years, but genuinely, honestly, in the real way of people who have decided that showing up is not enough, but that it is, at least, the place you have to start. He drove home on the L. Not a bus, the train, rattling on its elevated tracks above the city, the same city he'd lived in and driven through for 51 years, and he stood in the car with his hand on the overhead bar and watched Chicago go past the windows, the water towers, the rooftops, the alleys he knew, and the alleys he'd never seen, the back windows of apartments where people were just beginning to turn on their lights against the early December dark. The train moved through the city the way the city moved through time, without asking if you were ready, without softening the turns, with that particular honesty that had always felt, to Daniel Marsh, like a kind of home. He got off at his stop. He walked the 3 blocks to his building in the snow, which had decided, by now, to commit. He went upstairs and took off his good shirt and hung it carefully. He stood at the window. The streetlight came on. He thought, "I would sit in any parking lot in the world." He thought, "It's not too late to say so." He picked up the phone. He called Marcus, not because Marcus had said to, not because there was anything specific left unsaid, just because it was 5:53 in the evening in Chicago, and the light was on, and he was here, and so was Marcus, and that was enough. It was, after all these years, entirely enough. And so, our story comes to an end. Thank you for walking these cold Chicago streets with us today. Until we meet again in another tale, take care of yourself, and make sure to make that call to the ones you love before the streetlights come on. Goodbye for now.